Good. Well, just a bit about myself. My career has been a whole series of accidents, really. I suppose my first proper paid job when I was at school was selling jeans on Faking and Market at the age of 16, and I finished up as chief executive of a £750 million pound business at the age of 55. So I spent 20 years in the public sector, in the armed forces and the Ministry of Defence, and I spent 20 years or so in the private sector, and in the last 20 years I've spent 10 of those as a trustee of a major charity which specialises in helping people manage the transition from public sector to the private sector. And now, having sort of semi-retired, I've got my own business which works putting user behaviour management software into large organisations to reinforce positive behaviour and flash up cases of fraud, as it happens. I have been through the Open University MBA programme, and I've got a degree in psychology with them as well, and I know where a lot of you are sitting now. So hopefully what I'm going to cover this evening, it'll take about 35 or so minutes. You'll find some help. So it's called Public to Private Sector Transition. So the background to this is that there's a little bit of science in here. People do perceive reality differently, and when people look at how they're going to view a personal situation, they act accordingly. And since we all perceive reality differently, as I said at the outset, our reactions are different. And equally, managers who spent their career in the private sector will tend to view those in the public sector as different. Not bad, not worse, just differently. And a lack of awareness of this fact, which it is a fact, can make for a challenging transition. And the transition really is getting the job, doing well in the job, and excelling in the job from public to private sector. But labels matter, and at one end you might say, well, the private sector, could be typified by the David Brent character in The Office, who's particularly unreconstructed, perhaps, and not particularly politically correct these days. And at the other end, if you really want to poke fun, you could say maybe the public sector is personified by John Cleese's character in The Minister of Silly Walks, and with a bowler hat and that sort of stuff. You get the message. The good news for all of you that are thinking about making this transition is on the page in front of you. People who apply themselves and make the successful transition from public sector to private invariably do very well in their new careers. So I want to stick with the positive stuff here. I can probably say with some evidence that the reverse doesn't always hold true. Now, that statement was from Chris Forbes, who's the chief executive of PhD Consulting, which has been running for about 30 years. He took it over from his father as a successful headhunter, and he's very pro people coming from the public sector and helping them go into the private sector. And I took this presentation to him and said, no, this is what I'm going to tell people. Is it right? And he added some stuff and removed some stuff. So the good news is that people who make the transition invariably do quite well. So today, there's some disclaimers. When psychology school disclaimers, I'm not racist, but, and you probably know what's coming next. But we're not going to focus on the transition. We're going to focus on from public sector to private sector, but we're not going to focus on the other way around. But some of the lessons maybe apply in reverse, and I know people that have yo-yoed between the two. Why are we talking about this? Well, it's what you asked me to do. I had a long chat with Janet, and she said, there's a lot of interest in this. Could you put something together and share your experience? And it's based on my personal experience making the transition, and also helping literally hundreds of people over the past 12 years or so manage this transition and land themselves jobs. Some of them who have been unemployed for quite some period of time. What I have Googled it, and I thought, well, there's a lot out there. I haven't sort of gone out and downloaded everything you can find on the internet around this subject. You can do that yourself. I looked at it and thought, wow, you know, there's a lot of stuff out there. You can look at it, but this is based on some of my experience, some of the academic stuff that I've done, and a number of the case studies that I have worked with a large national charity who focuses on this particular activity. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about, do the public and private sector labels matter? Is it really polarized between the one end and the other, or is it a spectrum? And are the differences real or imagined? A little bit of advice about how to find a job. A little bit of advice about how to land a job. How to survive in the first 6 months. And then how to achieve your potential in your new chosen career. And then sort of ask a few so what questions. What is this all about? How can you make it real? So I want to talk a little bit about labels. You know, we use the term public sector and private sector, and do labels matter? Well, they obviously matter to everybody on this call, because I wouldn't be able to talk to you without using those labels, because we wouldn't be able to have a sensible conversation. There's a bit of research, you know, done from the 1980s onwards about cognitive misers, and these are people, maybe recruiting managers, maybe headhunters that you go and see that have one particular angle, come from one direction or the other. And cognitive misers are typically, and this is a gross exaggeration and doesn't do justice to the authors of the work, and I do apologize to them, but you know, limited in information processing capacity, and therefore take shortcuts to simplify complex problems. Organizations are very, very complex and multifaceted. People are very, very complex and are the product of, you know, decades of experience in education. But people take shortcuts, and those shortcuts are not particularly helpful when they are applied inappropriately to people that are managing transition from one sector to the other. People often have these things called interpretive repertoires, which are recognized routines of arguments and evaluations, you know, through which people, again, recruiting managers, develop versions of identity. You know, males can't multitask. You get the thing. They are just too easy to trip out. Public sector people really don't understand profit. You know, private sector people don't understand the care and due diligence and fiduciary care that you have to put over when you're looking after taxpayers and public money, that sort of stuff. There's a stuff called confirmation bias, which basically, I mean, people will look for, all their antennas will be attuned to looking for things that confirm their perceptions. And so if they think you've come from the public sector, whichever particular element it is, they'll be looking for those things and give greater attention to those things which confirm their preconceptions, and less attention to information that contradicts it. So labels are unfair, and they're often imperfect, and they matter because people use them, whether we like it or not. So I'm not going to say one is good and one is bad. It's the fact that people use them, and they use them to categorize and put people into one category or the other, and often make huge mistakes and do themselves a big disservice when they are recruiting people. So moving from the public sector to the private sector, one is often labeled, and one needs to leverage or gear this fact up, and you know, make a lot of the good attributes. So what? Well, I just want to do a little poll. I don't want you to think too much about this. I've sort of given you a bit of a clue. I'll put the golf ball on the tee, if it will, and just want you to look at what I'm about to ask you, and just spend a few seconds. You know, first impressions, you know, they last a long time. But just you'll be presented with some organisations and statements, And it may well be like British Telecom, public sector or private sector, I don't know. It might be the British Army, public sector, private sector, don't know. And so you'll be asked to attribute them to either the public sector or the private sector, or don't know. And we'll let this little poll questions run in the background, and I'll continue talking over it. Don't spend too long on it.
Frank, I've opened it up to give people a chance to answer.
Good, all right. So those are the questions. Royal Bank of Scotland, the Financial Conduct Authority, accountable to Parliament, accountable to shareholders, profit and loss, evidence-based decision-making, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, the Traffic Warden, the BBC, YouTube, the Open University. There they all are. So while you're busy digesting those and having a little go at trying to answer them, and when you've finished, Janet will let me know. A little bit of a clue, I guess, as we go forward. Being forced to decide between public or private sector is not easy. And as I've said, the world is more complex than that. I might categorize the public sector as having very clearly defined job roles, and I might categorize the private sector as being more entrepreneurial and having less easily defined job roles. But there are a lot of initiatives now taking what is good in the public sector and putting it into the private sector. And one that I'm particularly involved with is the sort of senior manager's responsibility in financial services across the United Kingdom, where the Financial Conduct Authority is making the senior managers in financial services sign up to exactly what they are responsible for and how they interact with one another. A lot of that has been in the public sector for some time. I've worked in Whitehall, and it was quite clear where my responsibilities as a relatively junior opinion minion began and ended, and where the civil servants began and ended. So what the difference to a large extent, I think, are imagined today, and the reality is that we have, in both sectors, a series of roles on a spectrum, so from the sort of Whitehall Mandarin, which I painted as sort of John Cleese type person at one end, to a Silicon Valley IT startup based in Reading or Winnerish at the other. And I work with some of the people at the latter end today, and I have to understand that sometimes I take somebody with a Mohican haircut and stuff into a senior banking meeting, and they're different. And but actually, at the end of the day, people's DNA is much the same. These differences need to be understood, and we need to know how to turn these to our advantage when we're engaging, as it were, with the private sector in order to move our career forward. This might raise a few heckles with some of you, but all of these things were pretty much labelled at my door when I moved into the private sector in the early 90s, having spent quite a lot of time in the public sector. The most blinkered private sector cognitive misers, the lazy people who don't really bother to think for themselves, they just put these old labels on. They will probably say, oh, it's okay for you, you come from a situation when you have a job for life. Now, we know that's not true. You don't understand the need to make a profit. Well, that may be some truth, but you've been managing budgets. I think you have to say, no, I haven't managed a P&L, but I have managed costs, and I've managed cost centres, and I've managed targets and so on. You have a gold-plated final salary pension scheme. That used to be the case. That's increasingly less so. There's probably a little bit of the old green monster coming out there with recruiting managers and people are interviewing you. You do not understand the need to be accountable to shareholders. Well, reflect on that for a second. You have stakeholders in public sector jobs, even in a charity. You have people that are giving donations in the health service. You have your clients, you have your patients, you have the health professionals, you have Jeremy Hunt and the health secretary and all of the NHS to be accountable to. so you manage stakeholders. Managing stakeholders in a not-for-profit organisation and a public sector organisation, which is ultimately accountable to Parliament, and ultimately your decisions can end up in Hansard being quoted. You do have that degree of accountability, but it's not for shareholders, but it's stakeholders, and it is every bit as difficult. They might say that, oh, you focus on input rather than output. That probably used to be the case, probably 10, 15 years ago, and it's changing. But again, at the end of the spectrum, there is probably some element of that. The people that I work with in Silicon Valley, they might be coming to work at 10 o'clock at night, work till 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, and then go home. They're just interested in coding the idea that they've had, get it up in the system, put it in production. So they're not really monitoring them being in the office day to day. But if you're working in a public sector where you have to be there, being there on time is important. But that's not really public sector or private sector. It's really how you work as an organisation, how you interact, and there are different models in different organisations right across the spectrum that work in different ways.
Frank, I just put the poll answers up. I don't know if you can see them there.
I don't think I can, actually.
Okay then. Would you like me to read them out to you?
Would be helpful, yeah.
Yep, okay. For Royal Bank of Scotland, we've got 32% think public, 47% think private, and 21% don't know.
That just shows you,
sorry, 9% don't know.
that just shows you how difficult it is to label somebody from the Royal Bank of Scotland now. Yep.
Yes. The Financial Conduct Authority, we've got 74% saying public, 6% saying private, and 0% don't know. Accountable to Parliament is 79% public, private 9%, and 0% don't know. I'm just going to scroll down, bear with me one moment. Accountable to shareholders, public 3%, private 74%, and 0% don't know. Profit and loss, public 21%, private 76%, 0% don't know. Evidence-based decision making, we've got public 59%, private 35%, and 9% don't know. Facebook, public 3%, 74% private, and 0% don't know. Google, public 3%, private 71%, and 0% don't know. LinkedIn is public 3%, private 71%, and 0% don't know. We have a lot of people here who are very sure of their answers, which is nice. A traffic warden, we've got public 68%, private 9%, and 3% don't know. The BBC, public 71%, private 3%, and 3% don't know. YouTube is public 3%, private 71%, and don't know, 0%. And finally, the Open University, we've got public 35%, private 32%, and 6% don't know. That's very interesting. I'll let you answer that one, Frank.
Yeah, well, it is interesting, and I would say the Open University, when it started, was probably a public initiative. In order to attract and retain really good, talented people now, it's moving. We know we're having to charge. I'm not part of the Open University, but the Open is having to charge more and more. And so to attract the senior managers, some people at the top are being paid more than twice the Prime Minister. So I put those in there just to make you think about them, because they're not particularly straightforward. And the Royal Bank of Scotland is not just its share who owns it. And I've got friends who work at the Royal Bank of Scotland. When it went from being a private organisation to be a public sector, they started to have to spend a lot of time doing briefings and public money and so on. But the point is, you have to think about these things. The sort of Google and Facebook and LinkedIn, they're privately owned, but they own all your information, and they're accountable to you as shareholders and what they do with that information, and there are rules and rules and so on that determine that. But it does, sometimes you can make an easy answer, sometimes you can't, and I just think the point I'm trying to make is that these labels force sometimes an uncomfortable categorization on people. So what do we do about this? So returning to the move. Well, you need a set of stories. You need to be aware of these differences and some of these perceptions. Now, if some of you understand this, I'm sure you do. Recruiters use tools such as competency-based interviews. Now, I think these are they're really useful. If there are any HR people on the call, I can take questions from them. I think they're useful for people who've been in the workplace for quite some time. I don't think they're particularly useful for interviewing graduates. I think what you're really doing is you're interviewing the parents. But competency-based interviews require the interviewee to have concrete examples of where they have managed money, shareholders, stakeholders, aggressive targets, difficult people, selling. Everybody sells all the time. There's a perception that people from the public sector don't sell. The child that's 3-year-old, 2-year-old, kicking off in the supermarket to get its own way is selling. It realizes the power has shifted to it from the parents as soon as they've got an audience and they're selling. And so it goes on. And have to be accountable for profits. And so the competency-based interviews are the sort of questions you get will be, give me an example of when you've worked under pressure, give me an example of when your work was criticized, give me an example of where you had to face conflict of interest at work, give me an example of how you haven't got on with others and what you've done about it. Give me an example of when you've been out of your depth. And what they're really seeking there is a little case study of what you have personally done. A bad answer is, I picked up the phone and I got a cost consultant here and we sorted it out. A good answer is where you can have a preset little story which says exactly what you did. And it may well be, give me an example where you've had to manage shareholders. And you'll say, well, actually, shareholders and stakeholders, they're pretty much the same thing. And we had a new initiative when I was working at an NHS trust, and we had to roll out a new way of charging for some of our services, and it affected both the ministry, it affected the staff, it affected the health professionals, and it affected the people who had to collect, etc., etc. And so I had to talk to a lot of people, convince the change, document it, and sell the whole change management process. Now, when you're applying for a job in the private sector from the public sector, you need to build some of these things, and I put them in: money, shareholders, stakeholders, aggressive targets, etc., etc., etc. Build some of those into your CV as segues. Then, when you apply for a job, you have to put, typically, a personal statement or a covering letter. So your CV is like a generic, but it's pointing in the right direction with some flags. The statement probably builds on those parts of your CV that has specific competencies that are relevant to the job that you're applying for. And if you've done that correctly, what you will do is if you get through to an interview for this, you will tee up the interviewer to ask you to expand on those. Now you might, and so what you should have is a little story, just like the little bit of stuff I gave you, to build out all of those case studies. And when you go to the interview, if you've done it correctly, step one done correctly, step two, step three, also give me some examples, and you'll be ready. You might have a telephone interview first, and then you might have a physical interview second. And again, they'll be looking for consistencies. My advice to people, and I think the telephone interview, if you want a grand national analogy, which is quite often what I use when I run these sessions for the students down at Portsmouth University, the telephone interview at the Beaches Brook. is where people want to exit there. They're looking to cut the numbers down from a list of 100 to a list of 10. So if you have a telephone interview, treat it exactly the same way. And what I suggest to people is you stand up, you're on the balls of your feet, you're in a room, you have each one of your walls is divided into half, and you have your little story stuck up there with post-it notes about how you handle shareholders, another one about how you handle money, another one about how you manage change, another one on how you manage difficult people, and they're your stories. And then when somebody says on the phone, could you give us an example? You hold the phone in your hand, you walk over to the wall and say, well, actually, 3 or 4 years ago we had da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da, da-da-da-da-da, walk down, you're talking for the story, job done. Put it up there. So if you build these into your CV and you're prepared to flesh out the thing at the interview, you will give yourself a tremendous advantage and a competitive advantage right through the interview process, because you will be prepared and you will know that people are using some of these labels and they've got their, I wouldn't use the word prejudice because I think that's too strong a language, but they've got these little labels and they've got these interpretive repertoires and they'll throw it your direction because they're pretty lazy and they just can't work out that everybody is different and they've all got different values and things to add. Practice telling the telling of these scenario stories and practice at home, talk to your dog, your cat, your partner, whatever. Just bring them to life, sell them with passion, make sure that they are real and grounded, and you will put yourself in a very good place. So let's say you've done a good job. You're in there now and surviving the first 6 months. I put this in there because it is tough. You've done a good job, you're in there. What I should suggest you do is what I suggest to a lot of people, wherever they come from when they're changing job, but especially under these circumstances, have a little book. Tell your manager you're going to do it if you like. Have a little book and note down what you find strange about the new job, the organisation culture. It might be the fact that they all queue up around the coffee machine for half an hour every morning at a certain time. Or it might be, when I went to work in New York, I was a standard that the Americans get into work when I was working at 7 o'clock in the morning, and between 7 o'clock and quarter to 8, they just spend 45 minutes wandering around each other's office, bothering each other, finding out what was going on. I found that weird. And then I kind of realized why, because the Europe people had been up and running for 5 hours, and they were finding out what was going on in Europe. But I found that strange. Write it down, and ask yourself why you find it strange. And at the same time, note that the old-timers, the people who have been there, don't find this strange. It is their normal. And you will find that after 9 months or 12 months, it will become your normal as well. And you've probably made the transition. But so it's not you, it's not them, it's just that it's a process of change. And understand that, and this is in my experience, and also the experience of a change management consultant who's got pretty much the same background as mine, and she's ex-partner in one of the big consultancies and manages a change management exercise and partnership now. And it is this, it's the boundaries in private sector companies are, this is exaggeration, okay, it's oversimplification, but they're less well defined than in public sector organizations. Old Harry always has the seat on a Friday over there when you're hot desking and nobody, that's that kind of stuff. And one only finds out when these boundaries are, when you cross them, you go and sit in Harry's desk and he comes in on a Friday, or you start to be an overly helpful person doing somebody else's job because you have got some spare capacity, and it's seen as threatening behaviour, it's seen as maybe an attempt to take their job. You get this story. Boundaries are less well defined. They're becoming better defined because they have to be, because the regulators, where they're regulated nationally, are demanding them. But just be aware of that. Because it can hurt. When you cross one of these things, it can hurt, both you and the organisation. Next thing is find an external or internal friend or mentor to help you through this process. There are people internally. There are people who've made the process before, and you know, they will know that you'll find this stuff strange, and you can say, "Oh, I find it really rather strange that you know, people do this kind of thing around the water cooler every morning." And so we always do that. And that's okay. That's just how we catch up. Or you know, avoid it because it's gossip. I find this gossip is a whole subject in its own right. I think it was George Harrison who labelled it the devil's radar. My advice is to don't do it. Stay completely away from gossiping or talking about people because there's no upside to it, and there tends to be a lot more of it in organisations in the private sector where people are feeling insecure and they're going through you know, periods of change or downsizing or you know, all that kind of stuff. So find an internal mentor or friend to help you and just bounce these things around. Sometimes the headhunter who puts you into the organisation won't get paid until you've done 6 months. They're incentivised to help you. And I know for a fact that Chris Forbes, who I mentioned beforehand, does this. They don't want you to go in and fail. So that's where those things come from. Learn the language. I think the biggest shock to me was when I went and worked for a US organization, a US sales organization based just in Boston. And I went to the kickoff meeting, and suddenly I was in Las Vegas with 3,000 people, and they were talking a totally foreign language and doing all sorts of things that were foreign to me. And I realized, you know, the problem wasn't them, the problem was me. And it was strange. The following year I went there, and you know, I kind of found it all normal. But the language, and don't be afraid to ask, because people will use terms that you don't understand, and if you don't understand what a term is, just ask, and they'll tell you. Lastly, preparation and rehearsal. Remember, people are going to have that confirmation bias, so make sure that you understand what they perceive to be your perceived development opportunities as somebody coming from the private sector, to the private sector and the public sector, and actually just make sure you prepare in advance and rehearse. And it is going to mean, you know, some late nights perhaps for your own benefit during the first few months. And then focus on output and what the company is trying to achieve with its clients, with its shareholders, as opposed to presenteeism. So those are the sort of my 6 tips for surviving the first 6 months. So be all you can be to achieving your potential. And as I said at the outset, people who do this tend to do very, very well on their own terms. It might not necessarily be, you know, that they're earning telephone numbers, but they get what they want out of their career, whatever that might be. Be honest. You come with honesty in spades, perceived honesty, and actually I think you do when you're looking after public money, public resources. So be honest. That's a positive attribute, reinforce it. Be fair. Be patient, because sometimes things happen in strange ways in a new organization. Be prepared. I've mentioned that. Be frugal. What do I mean by that? I was shocked after coming from years in the public sector, the way that people were not quite as careful with expenditure in the private sector as you would be in the public sector. And so don't drop to their level and take the whatever out of expenses when you're on a business trip. Do it exactly as you would do in the public sector. That is the right way to do it. And just because you're not being monitored all the time doesn't mean you can waste shareholders' funds. Be yourself. Don't try and be something you're not. And above all else, I put behave. And what I mean by that, you are, if you're coming from the public sector, I think the standards of behaviour are higher. Okay, my ex-compliance director, who was a good guy, he got the OBE for helping move the City of London forward in terms of compliance, once told my management meeting, when people were just saying, well, how do we, if it's not, but basically, it was saying if it's not written down, it's not legislated for, how do we know if we're doing the right thing? And it basically says it's really simple. If your mother or your father, your grandmother, read about what you were doing, sorry about the typo there, what you were doing or about to do in the Financial Times, do not do it if you were going to be ashamed of it. So, you know, if it's out there, don't be ashamed. Use your own sense of values and so on in order to determine what you do. You take those, gold-plated in some cases, across the private sector, live by them, and set a better standard. You've all seen lots of stuff in the press and so on where perhaps the standards of behaviour in the private sector have not been what they probably should have been during the course of the last decade or so. So that's me coming towards the end of my talking bit. We've got just slightly over 10 minutes left now. And what I thought I would do is just throw it open to you to ask me any questions you like around this subject. And
we have one from Richard Gadd. He's saying, I am not suggesting that the public sector is necessarily rule-bound, although I suspect it is less creative, innovative and entrepreneurial than the private sector. In my own experience, the public sector are less willing to make mistakes or learn from mistakes. And he goes on to say, would you agree that the public sector still regard value as least expensive?
I would, to an extent, I would agree with that. What I think the public sector people tend to change jobs more frequently every 2 years, and again, this is an exaggeration, but you very rarely have to live with the consequences of your own decisions. If you're an entrepreneur with your own business, or if you are working in a large FTSE 100 company, you absolutely have to live with the consequences of your own decisions. So there's a greater focus on whole life costs rather than the cost of acquisition. So I agree with that in the sense that people look at this, the cost, the cost of this, rather than looking at the whole life costs of the contract. Now, what happens sometimes is that when you over-engineer these things, like if you're getting a large service contract, I'll make this up to bring it to life, like say with IBM. Sometimes when you negotiate really, really hard, it's easier for IBM to pay the service penalty fees than actually deliver the service that you want. So I think that's right. I think also that things in the private sector are changing as well, because they are becoming much more public sector in the sense that it's very short term. If you don't, some of these sales jobs, you're only as good as your last quarter sales figures. So the public sector is actually moving in that direction as well, and I don't think it's a good thing. So I think we'll probably have a bit of an overcorrection at some point during the course of the next few years. I think we've got another question, haven't we, Joe?
We have, yes. Rob asked, what would you suggest as the best 3 competencies to include on your CV? And are there some key words which public sector applicants need to use or indeed not use?
Yeah, I think I've kind of touched on the key things is, I think, reliability. In all that means. Secondly, I would put. I would put stakeholder management, and thirdly, I would put communication. So I think you're reliable. And look. And what I mean by that is looking to add value to the organisation and a totally trustworthy thing, and also adding value in a way that short-termist stuff doesn't allow you to add value. Anything else? I think those are the key three things. But what I would say is they're not generic, and you need to read very carefully what the private sector job, what they're advertising, and go onto their websites and go into the social responsibility part of their website and find what they are flagging up as key to their organizations. And I'm not saying you should lie, but basically put a highlighter over the parts of your CV and your competencies that match with what they're trying to achieve as an organization.
Thank you, Frank. We've got another one here from Jen. Sounds to me that in reality the private sector is not that different from the current public sector. Moving from one department to another within the public sector means getting used to a new culture, language, etc. The advice Frank gives, behave, etc., equally applies to the public sector. Would you agree, Frank?
Yes, I do agree, and that's one. When I started to put this together, I did one presentation and I binned it because I thought actually it is this labelling thing, and I think that they are moving very, very closely together, and they are both benefiting hugely as a result. And those individuals, and you can spot them, that move from the public sector to the private sector and go back and forth between, they take a massive learning across the two organisations. I think they're becoming much closer together. I think as you say, moving between departments and different jobs within the public sector, it's pretty much the same. The significance of this, which is why I talked about the labels, is people who've spent their entire lives in the private sector just won't get it. So you have to make that real for them. And the example that you just quoted would be when they say, have you managed change? How would you manage the change between the two sectors? You can say, well, I was working for this particular organisation in Portsmouth Council, and I was working in finance, and it was all about accuracy and numbers and reporting. And then I got moved into managing the marketing as Portsmouth, as a historic centre, etc., etc. And I had to, and it was like a totally different job in a totally different sector, using different. And they said, oh, okay, you have done it. And that, when I was talking about stories before, it was that kind of thing. Have them tucked away. Know it's going to come up, and have a little example of where you have successfully managed that transition from one type of organisation with its values, behaviours and beliefs and all that kind of stuff, that kind of culture, into another one and done it successfully.
Thank you, Frank. The questions are coming in so thick and fast, I'm finding it hard to keep up with them now. I'm going to ask one more. There is one from Graham. There are references to the hidden jobs market. What is the best way to access this?
Did I make a reference to hidden jobs? Hidden jobs, what is the best way to access it? All right. I think I know where you're coming from. Networking is key. Okay, so I would use. I don't know which course you're doing with the OCU. I've got a.
I'll just interject here. I know Graham. He is one of our MBAs, so he is actually quite an excellent networker. So.
Yeah, that's great. I've got people I did my MBA with 20 years ago, and I still keep in contact with them. And there's a wonderful book. I think it's called The Brand of Me. So you kind of build up your own network, your own brand. The hidden jobs market. I think you know this. The jobs that are advertised, sometimes they just advertise them because they've already got an internal candidate. You know, the best jobs are the ones that find you. So you have got to make yourself findable. And how do you make yourself findable? Well, all the stuff that I've been banging on about today, you make sure it's in your LinkedIn profile. You have the words in there that if somebody does a search, it's got the stuff in there. So because you're going to be found by an individual that's in their first 2 or 3 years in the agency, and they're just going through it out trying to find. So you make yourself findable. That's one. You make yourself, you know what you do. And make sure that is known to your network, and also you are always being interviewed for your next job, whether you are talking to a supplier, whether you're talking to somebody externally, whether you're talking to somebody on the train. And when I said my career was a complete set of accidents that happened and was completely organic, if you will. And that's a fact, because normally, in almost every single case, my next job found me, and people said, well, no, would you be interested? So the hidden job market is the one, I mean, they're advertised and so on, but quite often people, and it's not right in some cases, in the public sector, they have to advertise. In the private sector, especially as you go down to the SME space, they just want somebody quick and fast. So make sure people know who you are, network like crazy, and I've got 2 sets of people that call me. One is the first who generally like to keep up, and I do like to keep up with managers I've mentored along the way, and they phone up, hey Frank, I just like to chat, how you doing, quick chat, And I've got other people who phone up when every time I ever hear from them is when they want something. And I don't like that. So make sure you keep your network alive by interacting with people in a positive sense, and not just reach out when you want something. So I think that probably answers the question.
Thank you very much